Hello, Mark. How are you?
Hello there. I'm very well, thanks. How are you?
Very good, thank you. Lovely to have you on the show.
No worries.
So, first of all, is writing a novel easier or harder than you first imagined?
Right. It's kind of both, to be honest. I mean, on one level, it's just sitting down writing words, on a page or a computer, and there's nothing easier than that. There's no heavy lifting. You're not going to put your back out. But on another level, you're sort of juggling a vast series of events and locations and characters and ideas, and you're trying to get them all to attach to each other in midair. And yeah, I think like any skill, it's quite easy to take the first steps along the path, but the road gets steeper as you go further.
Yeah,
It gets harder as you go on. But by pushing forward when it's hard, that's really when you do begin to learn. And I think only by challenging yourself that you even can grow as an author or as a person. That's the kind of thing I love to read. And I think all writers are readers first and foremost. We fall in love with the idea of a world or a galaxy or a universe that just sort of lives between those two book covers. And at some point in our lives, we realized that somebody had to think all of that up. Usually one person sitting alone somewhere thought all of this up, wrote it all down, and now anyone can go and visit that place whenever they like. And I mean, that's the closest thing to real magic that I've ever seen, losing yourself in a book like that. So yeah, I write what I like to read,
yeah,
which yeah tends to be sci-fi, fantasy, things like that.
lovely. Certainly a challenging genre to write in, I think.
It is, yeah. I mean, in some genres, you don't have to do very much world building. You need to know who your characters are and what their challenges are. But if they go to Starbucks, you don't have to describe what a Starbucks is. Everybody knows that.
Mm,
But in fantasy, certain things just need to be invented, and you need to work out how to tell your reader that what this thing is without it being 3 pages of information dumping.
mm.
I've read a lot of fantasy books where they go to whatever the fantasy equivalent of a Starbucks is, and you get 3 pages on the history of the coffee industry. It's like, well, fantastic. I'm really glad that you know all of this and you've done
Mm,
all this effort to put in a realistic world, but I want to know why they're there. I want to know who they're meeting.
mm.
I don't really care where the beans come from.
So you are one of the writing tournament judges. We're interviewing a few of the judges, so you'll be judging the first round. Um, what are you hoping to see from the contestants or from the stories?
Right. Well, as I said, I love a story that I can just get lost in. Something that grabs my attention, grabs my imagination, and sort of pulls me into the pages. Because I think the best stories are the ones where I look up from the book for a moment and I'm confused about where I am. I've got so deep into the world and the story. If the people and the places feel real enough to me, then I can be right there in the heart of the story. And yeah, if we get some stories like that, stories where we really feel like we're living there, then I love that.
Who's your favorite author and why is that?
Neil Gaiman, quite definitely. I love his use of language. He's always got the perfect word for every sentence, and his characters, as I said in the last one, his characters are so alive on the page. Every one of them's unique, every one of them's special, and the situations they find themselves in are often completely fantastical in every sense, but they react exactly like you expect the people to do, which is a lot harder to get right than it looks. You can believe me on that. But they feel so real that you're happy to follow them into this fantastic world. Wherever they end up, it feels real to you. And he writes across genres. He writes whatever he feels he wants to do next, which I find it hard as well to just stick to one genre. I know I do mostly sci-fi and fantasy, but I've got a list of ideas that are all sorts of genres. So
Mm,
he's definitely a role model for me there.
yeah,
You don't have to pick a tiny little niche and live in it. You can explore beyond where you began, basically.
yeah, yeah. Okay, Neil Gaiman. So, could you recommend just for our watchers maybe one Neil Gaiman book?
I think Coraline is a very good one.
Mhm.
It's aimed at younger readers, but it's still a really, really good book for any age.
Mm,
Um, there's a movie made of it as well, so you can see the difference between the book version and the movie version,
Yeah.
which is often interesting as well. Seeing what works in different media. You know, some things work brilliantly in a book, you can't put them on film, and vice versa.
Yeah.
So you've got that opportunity. But it's a good example of the sort of thing I'm talking about, where you've got this ordinary little girl with a great imagination who ends up in this situation that's completely unrealistic, completely unbelievable to some extent, but you believe it because you really do feel that she's so real, everything else has to be real as well. You know, so he sucks you into that world very, very efficiently, very effectively.
Well, I'll put that on my reading list. I've only read the Graveyard Book of Neil Gaiman, which I thought was fantastic, and I actually inspired the beginning of my book. I rewrote the beginning, but I've since binned that. Okay, so on to the next question. We've done your favourite author. Now, who's your favourite hero, and why?
Right. It's not one of Neil Gaiman's, actually, having said that, but it's Arthur Dent from The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. Now, you might argue he's not actually a hero. He doesn't do anything heroic, certainly. To be honest, he barely does anything other than complain about not having any tea, which I can understand. I'm English. But he is the perfect everyman, placed into this surreal and an utterly bizarre universe. And he reacts the way I think we all would. You know, he stumbles around and he asks the daft questions and generally completely overwhelmed. Like I said in the previous questions, that I think is key to bringing me into a story anyway. And I think for a lot of people is believing the character. And if you can believe the character, then you can believe what happens to the character. We might all want to be the all-conquering heroes, saving the world from terrible perils, but I think we all know we'd be terrible at it if it really happened. You know, I couldn't be Batman, I couldn't be Iron Man. So I love Arthur Dent for showing us that side of just being plunged into a situation where we're out of our depth and doing your best, just hanging on, trying to make sense of it.
All right, I'll check it out. I'll add it to the list. In a few years' time, I'll get around to it. So moving on to the next question. I will read. I've got my little sheet here. I won't hide it because I can't remember all the questions off the top of my head. So we both listened to a podcast. It's kind of how we got in touch. Called the Bestseller Experiment, and they have a 200 word a day challenge. They advocate for trying to write 200 words a day, and to promote a good writing habit. And this often turns into many more words. And this is something which Mark, probably more than anyone that I've heard, has achieved great success with. So tell us a little bit about how many days you've done this for, and a bit about the challenges and why you do it.
Well, at the time we're recording this, I'm just about to break 500 days in a row. So quite a milestone. I mean, that sounds like a lot, and well, it is, but it's one day at a time. You do it all one day at a time. And I started because I wanted to write more than I was. Back then, I'd write a few hundred or maybe even a couple of thousand words in a day, but then I wouldn't do anything for a while. It worked fine, but writing when I feel like it isn't going to get a book finished. So I needed to make it a sort of fixed part of my life. And it was around that time that the Bestseller Experiment podcast that you mentioned introduced this idea of just 200 words a day. Now, 200 words doesn't take long to do. I can do that in about 10 minutes on a good day, especially if you're not too worried about the quality of the words. If you just get 200 words down, it's easy to squeeze that in somewhere. And it adds up. I've written over 300,000 words in those 500 days. Now, they're not all very good, and some of them are rewriting words I've already written, but that practice is definitely making it better, making me better at better writing, and having it as a habit that I don't want to break, seeing that streak behind me and not wanting it to end, that makes it a bit easier every day. There's a lot of psychology behind it. Like you said, it's about forming a habit, and setting the bar that low. Some people think, well, you're not going to get anywhere with 200 days, but 200 words a day rather. But it does mean you're more likely to do it, because if you're doing something like NaNoWriMo, you've got to do 50,000 words in a month, which is nearly 2,000 words a day. You know, that's a lot. And if you miss a day, you've now got 4,000 to do. And that looks overwhelming. Whereas 200, that's easy enough. You're more likely to do it, and then you'll probably keep going anyway. I mean, I've averaged about 600 words a day just by telling myself I have to do 200. So that definitely works.
Did you write an article on your website about the 200 word a day challenge? I seem to remember.
I did a little mini series about how I did it, why I did it, basically expanding on what we've just talked about. So I don't know if you want to put a link to that somewhere.
I'll put the link to Mark's website and I'll put that in the notes, so have a read. And I'll also put a link to the Bestseller Experiment podcast.
Yeah.
The two guys that do that are the finalist judges. So moving on into round 7. Okay, so what writing tips? We've covered some writing tips, but what other writing tips would you give young writers, possibly people entering the writing tournament?
I think the answers I've given so far are a pretty good indication, but if you know who your characters are, then you know everything, I think. You don't need to put all of that on the page, and we've talked about, the history of coffee for 300 pages, but you don't have to put everything about your characters on that page. But as long as you, the author, know what the characters want, then you'll always know what happens to them next. So think about any book you've read recently, all the adventures, excitement, everything it described. But think about the main character, the person who lived through all of that. Now, try and imagine describing the story without saying anything about that character at all. Now, in a good story, that should be impossible. The character should be the only person that fits that story, it fits that adventure, and the story cannot happen without them. Now, that's the challenge. It's not easy, and you'll probably take a few goes before you get anywhere near it. But for me, that's how stories can work. If you know what the characters want, if you can believe in the characters, as I've said before, if you believe the character in that world, then the reader will follow you.
Lovely. Well, great tips. And I think, I don't think I know that Mark has provided some extra tips as well, which I'll be publishing on the website when I pull my finger out. So final question. So the first book that Mark published was called Jacob's War. So if you could just tell us a little bit about that, Mark, and tell us what inspired the story, and it's a prequel to a series, giving half of it away here. So if you can tell us about that and where we can find it and what to expect.
Well, thank you for asking. It is a prequel to a series of books I'm writing, and it's all focused around a fictional Fey Defence Society. Their job's to protect the world, or, well, at least England, from the supernatural threats that surround us and threaten us. Jacob himself is a war veteran from the First World War, still suffering from shell shock, and he and his team are tasked with defending Stonehenge from attack by forces from another world that exists alongside our own. I was inspired by the idea that the fairy tales used to be a lot darker than the ones we're familiar with today. I don't know if you've read any of the original Brothers Grimm versions of the fairy tales, but they documented all the folk tales of the sort of the 19th century. And by modern standards, they were pretty nasty. Certainly, if you only know the Disney versions of the fairy tales, you're going to be in for a nasty shock. So I had the thought, what if all these stories were true? All those creatures we've heard about, were much nastier and much more violent than we thought. So, someone's got to deal with them. And the Fey Defence Society was born. So yeah, Jacob's War, set just after the First World War, but the rest of the series are going to be more in the present day, following Jacob's great-grandson. Yeah. But I had a lot of fun writing it, so I don't rule out going back to visiting that interwar period and Jacob himself.
And, it's a wonderful book. I've read it myself, and you can get it on Amazon. Is that correct?
It's pretty much everywhere, but yeah, Amazon's usually the easiest place to find things.
Yeah.
For good or worse.
The Amazon. Great. All right. Well, I think that's about it. It's been lovely talking to you, and thanks for coming along. And hopefully we can hear more from you in the future when you've finished the first book of the series, and also the sequel to War of the Worlds, which is quite an undertaking. I'd like to hear more about.
Yes, yeah, I think we've run out of time for today, but yeah, very excited about that one. Nearly done.
Lovely. Oh well, I will wish you well and take care.
Thank you. Take care. Bye-bye.